listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. This is the show that talks about identity and access management and making sure you know who has access to what. Let's get started. Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How are you?
Oh, not so bad. Yourself?
I'm doing good. I've been living in PowerPoint hell like nonstop for the past week or two, and more of that this week. But it's on I've realized that what I do when I build PowerPoints, where I start is like paper and pencil. I kind of start with, I feel like during a presentation, you need to tell a story, and you should be able to tell that story without slides, right? You should be able to conversationally tell that story. So that's why I like to start with paper and pencil. I know you kind of, probably the first time you met me, I was taking notes in a meeting with paper and pencil, and it's just, I'm kind of an old school guy from that perspective, but I feel like if I sit down at a computer and I start, working out that strategy, like what's the problem today? What are we recommending for the future? Things like that. Then I get too bound up in formatting and how the slide is going to look versus focusing on the message.
Yeah, I remember the first time I looked at your notes, and it was probably a diagram that you had drawn out. And so, just, draw it on a piece of paper and send it to me, and I'll figure out, how we want to kind of show it on the screen. And we used to have scheduled time where I would have to interview Jim and decipher his handwriting. What is this trying to say? Like, is that Sanskrit or some other language? I'm not exactly sure. You definitely have doctor's handwriting, that is for sure.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably the only perspective I qualify to be a doctor, but I definitely have doctor's handwriting.
It's gotten better now that we've gone a little more digital and using, tools like Visio and Lucidchart and stuff like that. But
it's kind of a combination between graffiti and just plain chicken scratch. Chicken scratch with a funky style.
I think what we should do is digitize some of your work and create some NFTs off of it, and then put it out there for people to collect as, collector's items. Like, here is, a drawing that Jim made. You figure out what it says. What does it mean to you?
Or we could create a font.
Oh, yeah. Microsoft is replacing the Calibri. Or I'm not sure how you say it. Calibri,
I think
whatever
it's
it is.
Calibri, yeah.
Yeah. So they're going to replace the default font, which is, I guess, kind of a big deal.
Yeah, they probably won't. They probably would not replace it with my chicken scratch.
I hope not. But, all right, now we're getting a little bit off the sidetrack. If you have a Windows PC and you have inking capabilities, you can actually create a font based on your own handwriting. It's built into Windows somewhere, Windows 10, in one of those settings, is you can actually go through a process where you write out the alphabet, numbers, some things like that, and it will basically create a true type font for you based on your own handwriting. So you could theoretically create your own font, put that into a PowerPoint, and then have like a PowerPoint that looks like you actually wrote it out by hand. Which is so meta, I don't even know where to go with it after that.
It's kind of like Comic Sans, but actually I think that would be really fun to do. I actually might look into that. I did not know. That's why people listen to the podcast, Jeff, is for the gems, or some might say the doggy diamonds.
Yeah, the solutions to problems that you don't have. I think that's part of it as well.
You didn't know you had.
Right. Why don't we talk about some identity and access management stuff, since that's pretty much why we're here and what we do. We're going to talk today about Zero Trust Network Architecture, also known as ZTNA. So as you hear us maybe talking through that, I know Zero Trust has been top of mind for a lot of folks, especially with the pandemic and people doing remote work. And, we talked with Eric Anderson from Adobe last week about their approach to ZTNA. And they're actually ahead of the curve. They've been in this ZTNA model for a couple of years. So they were well prepared for a mass, work from home, VPN-less environment, right? Things like that, right? To make it more secure to access resources. So to help us with the conversation today, we've invited Brian Deitch, who is a solutions architect at Zscaler and an all-around good guy to the show. So welcome to the show, Brian.
What's up, everyone? Thanks for having me. And I would tell you that the greatest lie that the devil ever told was that he didn't create PowerPoint. I feel that pain, guys.
I've learned so much about PowerPoint having turned to the dark side and consulting, 5, 6 years ago at this point. I use it for way more than just presentations. It's a simple, flow chart thing. It's basic bare bones image editing. So, I have a love-hate relationship with it. I just wish that the feature parity between Microsoft and Mac OS was a lot closer, because it is clearly a first-class citizen on Windows devices, which, you would, I guess, expect, right, from a Microsoft product and a Microsoft hardware. But I am glad to see that the Mac OS version is catching up, because I do use both OSs quite a bit, and it's always interesting going from one to another. But I digress as I get off my PowerPoint soapbox there. Brian, this is your first time being on the show. And one of the things that we like to ask our guests is to learn more about their background and how they got into the InfoSec or the identity space. Is that something that you chose, or did you choose it?
So funny conversation. So I started my journey back in the day at US Airways, which is now American Airlines. And I was a systems guy supporting usairways.com. And I quickly wanted to make sure that I solidified my position and didn't want to ever be like, part of a RIF or anything like that. And I took responsibility over an F5 appliance. At that point in time, was used primarily for web acceleration and load balancing. And it was kind of a funny thing, because it was like this mixed bag of tricks where it was a layer 4 device, but it was also layer 7. And I wanted to be part of the cool group with network security guys. And they didn't like me for some reason. I couldn't get them to accept me. And lo and behold, it turned out to be a good thing. They wanted nothing to do with the device that can talk over layer 4, layer 7. That was me. And that kind of opened the door to Pandora's boxes. And then from there, I moved from there to Apollo Group, which is University of Phoenix. And they said, well, knowing F5 is great, but we need you to understand, the Cisco ASA, the Checkpoint Firewall, Snort IPS. I mean, you name it, they own that particular product. And oh, by the way, you're going to be on call here in 30 days or less, so you better ramp up quick.
It's a little bit of a trial by fire, it sounds like.
Yeah, absolutely. Best mistake I ever had.
What else do you work on when you're not doing stuff for Zscaler? I know you've got a podcast called PEBCAC. Maybe you can talk to us a little bit about that as a fellow identity kind of related podcaster.
Yeah, right on. Thanks for the name drop on there. Me and a couple of buddies from Zscaler decided that, maybe kind of cool idea to have our own podcast. And so PEBCAC actually stands for the problem exists between the chair and the keyboard, right? User error. So many times, right, we get involved, whether it was network or security, where we are the ones to be blamed, and at the end of the day, it's always the user. So we go over a lot of security topics. Sometimes we do like silly dad jokes, product reviews, and whatnot. But we are going to be recording episode 7 today, so we're quite a distance behind you guys.
Got to start somewhere. Brian, one of the things that we like to do with the podcast, right? It's called Identity at the Center, right? A lot of the focus of our podcast is on identity and access management, but we think it's becoming the central tenet of information security strategies. I mean, that's what we're seeing. I think in a zero trust world, it resonates very well. But we want to use this as a forum to introduce kind of the other technologies that make up a full zero trust information security portfolio. So maybe what you could do is kind of talk to us about what your company Zscaler does and where that fits into a zero trust architecture.
Gotcha. So if you think about it, Zscaler and ZTNA, they're kind of synonymous. And at the end of the day, what we want to do is federate with identity, right? Let them be the gatekeeper of the users, who they are, what they do, what groups they're a part of, and take that and apply that principle to users going out to the internet. So allow the good, block the bad. And then for users that need to talk to internal applications, whether they reside at the legacy data center or in the private cloud, allow them to interact with those applications based off of identity.
So how does this actually work? What's the user experience like? Is it something that kind of sits behind and the user, if it's being done right, never actually sees? Or is this something that is a little more upfront and present to a normal user who would be accessing resources?
Yeah, we really want to make this as transparent to the end user as possible. So, from a user experience, if they're sitting in a branch office and they close their laptop lid and they go home, or they go to Starbucks, they open it up, it's like they're already connected to the network. They don't have to do anything, they don't have to enroll, they don't have to re authenticate things. Now, you could if you wanted, but the premise between the ZTNA, right, is that number one, we want to keep users off the corporate network. So, you're going to treat all applications like you would Office 365. And so you can't get into Office 365 unless we know the identity of the user, right? You're not actually on the Office 365 network, but you have access to it. So even your internal applications will be treated like that. And then the second part to this is we really want to reduce your attack surface, meaning you can't hack what you can't see. You can't do DDoS, brute force, credential stuffing, SQL injection if there's no inbound access to your applications, wherever they might reside. And the last part is if you're not on the network, there is no lateral movement. And so really the idea is the internet becomes the new network. Being able to give the company true end-to-end privacy, right, via TLS tunnels, right? That way you don't have prying eyes cannot see. But at the same breath, right, you know, what is that user experience? They just connect to it and they're good to go. Now, the best part, I think, of doing this correctly would be a user going into Starbucks. Historically, on maybe a legacy VPN, they might have to turn that off to interact with like a captive portal. But in a true ZTNA world, right, I just want to allow them to transparently access that. Click the button that says, I'm going to be a good little internet citizen, and then boom, they are connected back to their applications without having to authenticate.
You know, kind of in my mind, the place that ZTNA fills is kind of a replacement for the traditional VPN. Maybe you could validate or re-educate me on that, but is that the case? And maybe you talk a little bit about the architecture, because I guess my understanding is that, you know, ZTNA, at least Zscaler, is provided as a cloud-based service, but ultimately you're providing access back into the network so people can reach applications, file shares on the network. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the architecture, because I'm assuming, like I said in the first part of the question, that, you know, we should look at this as kind of a replacement for VPN.
Absolutely. So definitely, I wouldn't say that, you know, true ZTNA is a user, is just a VPN, because we don't really want to dumb it down to that. And there's kind of like three moving parts to this entire puzzle. So one, on the endpoint, the end user, right, they're going to have a client that is used to steer traffic either towards the cloud broker, the zero trust exchange, and then you're going to also, which is the policy enforcement. Everything that goes on happens in the cloud. It says, who are you? What groups are you a part of? Can you do this? Now, earlier I mentioned that I don't allow any inbound access. So you're like, where's the Kool-Aid here, Brian? How are you allowing this user that's working from anywhere to interact with this application back at the data center or the private cloud? And that's where you need to be able to deploy a lightweight VM. Sometimes you refer to it as like an application connector, but this guy will be reaching outbound to the cloud. It should do this in a fashion that doesn't require username and password, probably certificate-based authentication, as well as a connection that can't be man in the middle or subject to replay attacks. So doing TLS plus perfect forward secrecy to basically allow them to meet in the middle. The end user hits the cloud says, yes, you can do, or you can go to this. And that outbound connection now becomes a reverse tunnel back in to the network to allow the end user to interact with the application. And the key here really is to be able to support all ports and protocols, right? You have Active Directory, which can be kind of noisy. You got file shares like CIFS. You have almost all applications now. They're running on 80.443, but we still have a handful of applications. It could be SQL, it could be SSH, RDP. Those are more of the corner use cases, right? We don't want to open up like SSH and RDP to all of the users, because now they're back on the network, right? Now they become that wild child in the environment and they can do lateral movements. That's the anti-zero trust. We want to basically keep them off, allow them to access the applications that they have access to based off of that business logic. And then all of a sudden your cloud becomes a strategic point of not only control, but visibility. What users are connecting to what applications at any given point in time.
Yeah, and I know from past experience with VPN, you know, with, let's just make a generalization here. With most VPN products, you can limit access to certain IP ranges or addresses and ports. But you know that very few organizations that I talk with actually do that. Right? It's more like you're on the network and you have pretty much full access. But I think with ZTNA technology, that's not really how it works. But it was interesting as you're talking about 80 and 443. I'm wondering also about like legacy technologies. Like, hey, we've run into a lot of organizations still that have mainframes, and those would operate over like a telnet port or something like that. Is that all? I'm assuming that's possible as well.
Yeah, so not only is it possible as well, the ability to support all ports and protocols from like a client to server initiated conversation is key. But the cool part about this is if you think about telnet or even port 80, these are protocols that they're like this, it's clear text in transit. So if you have Jim hanging out at Starbucks, right, and he's making a mainframe connection or telnet or port 80, what would a threat actor see, right? And that's really the part you need to kind of hone in on. So true ZTNA is going to say basically that threat actor that's hanging out in Starbucks is going to see an IP address inside Starbucks, is reaching out to the ZTNA cloud, and everything that's going on in between there is completely encapsulated in a TLS tunnel that is not subject for prying eyes to see. That makes sense?
Yeah, so you're encrypting all the way from the end device, in this case, probably a laptop, all the way to that. I'll call it an appliance that you put on the client's network, right? So if somebody was to
Yeah.
tap the wire and kind of see the traffic, it would just all be encrypted data.
Yeah, at the very best, right? They can't man in the middle of it because the connection won't even set up, right? So at the very best, they could try to do a replay attack, but even then, it's completely encrypted. We're enforcing perfect forward secrecy, which means the ephemeral keys are not in transit, right? So to do a replay attack, they're not going to be able to get anything else, get anything from that.
I'm also wondering with that appliance. So I'm thinking of large, multinational organizations where they have, data centers on multiple continents. Is the typical approach to put the appliances where the end systems are, or do most clients you see put those appliances just in one location, like say North America, and then once they're kind of behind that, through that firewall, then span the traffic globally?
So yeah, we don't want to try to hairpin them to singular areas, right? Because it creates a backhaul scenario, which diminishes user experience. So the idea would be deploy connectors as close to applications as possible. And so if you had, a couple data centers in North America, a couple in EMEA, right, and you had users that are hanging out in London, you don't want them connecting all the way back. Like, let's say, let me take a step back. Let's say application one is been distributed both in EMEA and in the Americas. You don't want a user to have to traverse the entire Atlantic Ocean to get to application one if application one exists in EMEA somewhere as well, right?
Right.
And so the idea would be as traffic is coming in and it hits that ZTNA cloud, it can do the measurements, right? The for lack of better words, free GSLB. Where's the user? Where's the application? It's available in two places. Let me stitch together that connection to the quickest end user experience for them without changing applications at all.
So I'm going to put my project manager hat on for a minute, and I'm kind of wondering, what do these ZTNA deployments usually look like? Is it kind of a big bang replacement of VPN, or do companies typically go after smaller use cases and kind of build out either by including more users, or what is the approach to kind of get started and then to kind of reach your end goal? And is the end goal usually replacement of all VPN?
It is 100% replacement of all VPN. So pre-COVID, it was a little bit more of a corner use case, right? Like it was a new idea adopting. For a lot of customers, they didn't really have a need to have or to replace their VPNs, right? Users were on-prem, they didn't really need it. Then all of a sudden COVID hit, And it was like just a ticking time bomb, right? You have all these users that are now off the network, and you have two options. Option one, buy more legacy hardware, deploy that, and there was crazy hold times for that kind of stuff, or adopt a cloud service friendly architecture, right, which is ZTNA. Now, by doing that, I would say that in large, with COVID, we saw a lot of big bang actually happen. I had talked to one customer in particular, like on a Thursday, 60,000 users, right? And then on a Tuesday, they cut a PO and they were ready to move. Like, it was that big of an issue for them. I think the most compelling thing here of this story was the ability to onboard all 60,000 people by the end of that month. So I think that the total time from PO to the time that they had to roll this out was like less than 3 weeks. Like, they had to move very, very quickly. That is something you just can't do on legacy platforms.
No, absolutely. That's pretty impressive numbers there. So I want to back you up a little bit. I think you kind of covered what the authentication scenario looks like, but I'm kind of wondering, okay, so walk me through a scenario where I've got a new person joining the organization, they're getting a new laptop. How do I get their laptop to be, do I push the client onto their laptop, etc., and then how's it authenticating? Is it leveraging the authentication into the laptop? In other words, like my Active Directory sign in, and then the other thing I want to layer in there, I do this sometimes. I ask multi-part questions. Layer in there, it could be a Windows laptop. It could be a Mac OS. I don't know. Maybe it could be a Chromebook. Walk me through that scenario of like, how do I get the client, and then what is it doing from an authentication standpoint? What is it leveraging, or am I pushing like some kind of certificate, things like that?
So there are a handful of customers that have gone down the route of bring your own Best Buy device. And when they do that, there's a manual enrollment, right? They'll have the user go to companyname.okta.com, for example. They'll set up their credentials, and then from there, they'll start downloading software to do whatever they want. There's also the notion of like, hey, we're going to, if you are a net new employee, right? Or I should say not net new to ZTNA, you want to be able to push that out silently to the endpoint. You want to be able to pick up whatever the user uses to authenticate, right? So if it's Active Directory, boom. One of the prerequisites for that will be IWA, Integrated Windows Authentication, because I don't want to make it hard to secure my users. I want to make it more or less transparent. And so when you talk about the client that's being pushed out, the secret sauce behind there is that the authentication that's going on in the background, you can push it out like with SCCM or your MDM of choice, but it can be told, hey, go ahead and try to connect. By the way, this is the authentication domain. Pick up the local credentials if they've already signed in once, and take that and transparently put them through. Now, on the back end, that's basically SAML, right? In this particular use case, your IDP would be Ping, Okta, Azure Active Directory, some of the big ones that are out there. So the ZTNA cloud is going to be the service provider. All we really want is a valid SAML assertion. But the next bigger part is that with the identity comes two things. One, you have users going out to SaaS-based applications, but they also have access to internal applications. So when I federate, I also want to support SCIM. I want to make sure that I have the latest and greatest group attributes for that user. So let's say that Jeff is working diligently, and then one day he has been promoted to customer, or he decides to leave the organization. If you burn him completely, anything he has on his device, now he could upload it to his own personal OneDrive, Dropbox, and things like that. The appropriate way to do this is, from a ZTNA perspective, is no matter what happens, if he's going out to the internet, whether it's SaaS or naked, always protect that. Always keep that in line and always protecting it. But if he has access to mission-critical internal applications, go ahead and immediately revoke that once you have burned that user in identity, whether that's Azure, Ping, Okta, you name it. And your mileage will vary based off of the IDP that you're using. Some of them, like in Okta, right, the integrations are so tight that the moment that you revoke access for Jim or Jeff going into an application, it's immediately picked up. versus like in Azure Active Directory, it's synchronized like every, I think, 15 minutes, maybe 45 minutes, or on demand. But spelling that out for customers, like, hey, listen, this is what you're going to do. Let's operationalize this. And then that way, if Jeff decides that he wants to put his 2 weeks in and you want to burn his access to internal applications, now you don't have to worry about him grabbing this stuff and then uploading it to his own personal Dropbox. You can be able to lock that and secure the company and minimize the risk.
Yeah, I think that's an important part here is we've been talking about network access and getting access to data, but what happens once the data is on the device is typically challenging. We see things like sandboxing and VMs and all kinds of exotic ways, right, to protect the data that's no longer in motion and it's at rest on a device. I think that's part of the challenge. You mentioned a couple of things there as you were talking around the transparency to the end user is obviously a big deal, right, for a security perspective, because if it just works, you're going to gain alignment and that people are using the secure pathways that have been defined. When it comes to the price of ZTNA versus a traditional kind of VPN only network access, how do you see the comparison between the two? Is cost a factor that is something that might be prohibitive for some companies, or is it pretty equivalent? I guess help me understand if I'm a CISO and I'm thinking about making the spend to address ZTNA. Where do I make the spend, and how does it compare to what I already have in place through something like a VPN?
Like an AnyConnect, yeah, exactly. So the first thing you have to really identify is that you really are subscribing to a premium cloud service for ZTNA, right? In that you are doing so based off of identity. So to figure out exactly what your cost is when adopting cloud is very easy. If we have 5,000 users, we're going to need 5,000 licenses. And I don't need to buy an appliance that can go from 5,000 to 10,000, right? Because now you have this thing that you're hedging a bet that if I buy this one particular appliance, it's going to be good for the next 7 years, maybe not. What happens if we acquire a lot of companies? I'm going to have to rip and replace that. And so that's one of the definitely the nice things about ZTNA from a cloud perspective. And I can't speak on behalf of all vendors that are out there, but I know for my organization, right, at user 5001, we are not going to start blocking them randomly, right? In fact, we're just going to allow them to keep connecting, but at some point in time, you're going to have a true up, whether it's at a quarterly business review or at the annual renewal, and to say, hey, you know what, you bought 5,000, you had 5,500. From this moment forward, we're going to start charging you for 5,500. We'll forget the past, right? This is an adult relationship. We're going to, it behooves us both to, be having a good time here and not be tripping over, silly things in life.
Yeah, I think we see a lot of things like, monthly active users and kind of an average over a year or a period time frame. I think that's pretty common. I've seen that with a lot of different vendors that play in this authentication space. And you certainly hope that it is a mutually adult conversation and approach to services, at least until, our procurement and maybe legal friends get involved and start wrangling over some things. I've certainly seen things get derailed around that. One of the things that I'm also interested in is around the privileged access management component for Zero Trust. When you have resources that are maybe on the network, Windows servers like a domain controller or Unix boxes, or even just any server that's been identified as kind of sensitive and underprivileged kind of management, in addition to the cloud, is that something also that Zero Trust can help, or is it more focused on stuff outside the firewall?
I would say that we complement that scenario right there. And to be transparent, what I want to do is bring you to the front door of that server. And however you do privileged access management today, that's fine, right? That's between the server and however you're checking in your credentials and whatnot. But one of the things that I would like to say is that I see a lot of customers that are doing multi-factor authentication. Like you can't even talk to the front door of that server unless you've done MFA. MFA, like if you're bored, go out and watch videos on something called Evil Jinx and how incredibly easy it is to phish a user, get them to sign in, take their session keys and have access into everything OneDrive and all the chaos that it can do from there. So MFA can be easily defeated. So from my perspective, I love, like, if I'm going to pick on conditional access, I would love to just be like, hey, you know what? If you want to come in and talk to this segment of the network, where it's a Windows server, it's a database server that has all of our PCI information, then how about I posture it, right? Make sure you're coming from a domain joined or domain joined PC as opposed to Grammis PC, where there might not be endpoint security that's running on there. I can posture for certificate, right? I can do different things that, to do the integrity of the user coming in. But probably the coolest thing that I have seen recently is around an integration that my company has with CrowdStrike. And basically, the agent that's running on Jeff's Windows PC can talk to CrowdStrike, and it can actually posture for what is called a zero trust access score. So 0 meaning you are, like, it's bad news. There's something terribly wrong with your PC, and 100 being benign. Like, you're a good dude. We allow this stuff. And then I can marry that score to policy. Like, hey, you can get in and talk to anything with a risk score of 70 or higher, right? But if you want to talk to the PCI DMZ, before I even give you that front door, you need to have a risk score of 90 or higher. And it gives the end users or the people, the stakeholders in this, the peace of mind knowing that I'm just going to have some random person coming in. It's true zero trust. They're not going to get in past the cloud. The buck stops there.
So, Brian, you're our expert on the ZTNA industry. We don't know the industry. And what we would like to ask would be you to be a visionary. Put on your visionary cap for a second and tell us what's coming down the road in terms of what is the future for the industry, in terms of, big changes and features. Do you see ZTNA becoming like a platform where third-party developers go to, or do you see ZTNA being folded into other platforms like, say, single sign-on platforms, Okta or Microsoft? Do you see a consolidation in the industry? What is your perspective on where the industry is heading?
All bets are off with Microsoft, right? They used to have like that VPN platform. I forget what it was called. It's soon to be retired, right? But if they see a need, right, they tend to bake that into their products. I would say that when you look at zero trust, one of the biggest Achilles heel, right, especially if you move very, very fast, because I always tell customers, users 1 to 100 are going to be far more difficult to onboard than users 100 to 60,000, right? Once you work out the kinks there, it's pretty much streamlined. But you need to have, at some point in time, you got to go back and take the information that's coming through, right? You might have a wildcard policy that either ends in allow or in deny. But as that traffic is flowing through, like, you might know about 70 internal applications, but you'll be shocked to find out that your end users actually access like 700, right? How do you actually get to true zero trust on that per application level? Now, I know on our platform, we're going to basically show it as a bubble. Like this, these are the top talkers that have been learned more or less. But I want to see an evolution a little bit more granular. Right? Not only do I want to see it to be like these are the top applications that are being accessed that have not been defined yet, but I also want a recommendation of what Active Directory groups or group membership in general should be assigned to those. I'd love to see some machine learning on that to be transparent.
Yeah, you got me thinking there that could be some machine learning. Another cool feature might even be some self-service for the users, where they kind of are able to go in and make the ZTNA aware of applications that they need access to.
That kind of happens today, right? If you have a user that is requesting access to something, whether they have it or not, it would populate the dashboard as a defined or a recently discovered application. The self-service part would be nice because then you can say, well, I'm part of HR and I need this to do my job, right? That helps narrow in the focus a little bit there.
So you've been really generous with your time, and I want to make sure that we kind of stay on with that. One of the things that we have started to do more recently is to get into a little bit of non-IAM trivia or questions. And, I think one of the questions that we were talking about earlier might come up with this is kind of like our prep session. Jim, you want to ask the question that we came up with?
Yeah, sure, because we're all either fathers of human or fur baby children, and probably most of our listeners have one or the other as well. The question for this week is, if you were able to go back and give yourself some fatherly advice, what would it be? We'll start with you, Brian.
Yeah, so this one is near and dear to my heart. My oldest is leaving for college. She's 18. She's graduating this year. She's done a phenomenal job and has full ride offers in state. And it definitely brings me to tears sometimes just to think about her not waking up in my house, right? Is this weird? And I've gone back and I thought, what are some of my biggest regrets? And so they're kind of threefold, and hopefully they're easier. But number one, when they were younger, my recommendation to any new father is to just hold them as much as you can, because before you know it, they're just big, and that's just not going to happen. I miss that so much. And then the second one would be to really get into their world. I was always a basketball guy, track guy, and my daughter, she loves soccer. And I didn't know anything about it, and I did my best to kind of root her on from the stands, but I regret not taking the time to really learn the sport, becoming great at being a forward myself, right? That way I can help teach her and coach her. I think I missed the ball on that. And the last one is, celebrating the smaller victories. So in the Deitch household, like if you want a cell phone, then you need to have straight A's. And if you don't have straight A's, then you don't have a cell phone, right? I'm not going to work hard if you're not going to work hard. Now, she did great in high school. Obviously, she's getting full ride scholarships, right, to be able to do stuff. And what I didn't know about that statement was that I was slowly crushing her self-esteem every single time she brought home anything lower than an A, right? So when it came time for college, she was like, oh, I don't know if I want to do this. I don't really want to apply. And then it took this leap of my wife saying, we're going to apply today, and we're going to see what happens. And then she gets accepted, and it's the full ride, and she's blown away. And then it went from, I don't really want to do this, to I can't get her to stop applying to colleges. Like, it's insane. So those are my big three. Hold them as much as you can. Get in their world. Celebrate the small victories. And I'll leave it at that.
That's well thought out. Jeff, how about you?
Yeah, that's another good question. So I have dogs. Those are my children, my two dogs, Layla and Duncan. And the first thing obviously is stay active and take those pups for a walk every day. It's like the greatest thing in the world for them. But from the human perspective, I think about it, if I'm looking back when I was, younger, really think about what you want to be when you grow up. If you don't know, take the time, explore, figure it out, right? I think sometimes there's a lot of pressure, especially maybe in, the high school or early kind of college folks, that they're being pressured into careers that they don't really want to be in. And they may be doing it for any number of reasons. They don't know. They're just kind of going with the motion or whatever. I think they should take the time. And, this is what I would have done is, take the time to figure out what I want to do when I grow up. I spent 10 years in the food service industry before I even got into IT. So, I've taken a certainly a different approach than maybe some others. I think, Brian, you brought up an interesting part about, learning the fundamentals, right? Basketball, learning how to box out, right? Simple things like that. And I think that applies really to anything is, learn the fundamentals of things that interest you. Don't try to skip ahead and read the last chapter before you get to it. And that'll help you truly understand things. And I think my last one is to travel. Learn from other cultures, other people. Don't stay in your bubble and get that, reinforcement of all the things that you think are true that may or may not apply to other people out there in the world. So I think everyone should, take the opportunity to get out into the world, do some international travel, see how other countries are approaching, their lives and their issues, and, take that as a data point to inform your worldview rather than, maybe being focused on just your little corner of it. Good question, Jim. What about you?
So I also have three. The first two, the reason I have three is I kind of went through the first two. I'm like, yeah, I kind of got that advice and I did that, but I think there were keys, right? The first one was save your money. So you can't just like spend all your money and especially live in debt, right? I think that's probably one of the most important things you can do in your life is live below your means and save some money for the future. The second thing was try to find balance between kind of the things you enjoy doing and working. And I was that way where, I went out, I enjoyed my life, but at the same time, I carved out the time to make sure that I was getting educated, learning new things, and working. The third thing, which I never really got this advice, but I realized it today. I was having a call with Ash Matawala, who is the co-founder of Identropy, the company that Jeff and I were with prior to now being over at Protivity. And, we got into the conversation about accounting, and I said, both of my grandfathers were accountants, and what I realized is that they are very risk averse, right? And I learned a lot from them. I was very close to my grandfathers, and I am a very risk averse person. But I look at Osh, and the reason this clicked was Osh went out and became like a business entrepreneur and took risks. And there were times he told me stories where you don't know if you're going to get that next contract and make that next paycheck in order to be able to pay your employees. But taking those risks, obviously, it kind of goes back to balance. You have to balance taking risks with not taking risks. But I was always very risk averse. So I think especially while you're young, while you have kind of less to lose and where you can take some more risk, don't live in fear of risk. You got to be willing to take some risks. And I think starting a business while you're young, that's a great way to do it.
Dude, we are like 100% on the same page about being risk adverse and pushing the kids to do that, right? And I didn't know the expectations of like, hey, A's are expected, B's are okay if you ask for help, and C, like, don't come home, right? Like that was like the mantra that I had. And the way that kind of bit me in the butt was my son's sophomore year in high school. He's a junior now, where I openly saw like him becoming risk averse. Like I can either go out with my friends for an hour or I can study, right? And he just kept doing the whole like I'm going to study all the time. So there's definitely a lot of fruit in doing well, but also taking some risk and having it. And once he found that out, like, hey, there are things that I can do, and I can still achieve good grades, right? And I don't have to study 12 hours a night to be able to get it done. And then Jeff, to your point on travel. We took all of the kids, my wife included, we went to Belize, and on, the first like 100 yards, right? It's a resort and it's beautiful. Beyond that, right? The extreme poverty, and what's interesting about that is the perspective is like, you see those kids, singing, in a full dress, the girls and the boys in long sleeve t-shirts, long pants, sitting in the sun in 98% humidity. They pay to go to school, right? Like that was kind of shocking to see that. And the kids looked at that and said, all right, this is, never would have believed it until you saw it.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the phrase first world problems and really kind of understanding, is this really a big deal or not? And maybe this a little bit goes back to my restaurant business where, maybe let's just say you're working at Chili's and it's a 5-table section on a Friday night and someone's ranch dressing is not the most important thing in the world at that moment. I'm just saying, right? That could be something that's out there. So, I think, travel is a good one. So, all right. Well, I think, we covered a lot of ground today. I think, what I'd like to do is just pass it around the horn real quick to see if there's any kind of final thoughts that the group here has. Brian, why don't you go first? Any final words of wisdom that you want to drop on us and our listeners?
Man, there's this whole idea in Zero Trust of the concept of browser isolation as well. That's something we didn't talk about today. That's something I definitely see coming in line, especially since so many applications are web-based. So look that up. And, I am very grateful to be on this podcast today. I definitely appreciate you guys' time, letting me bark at you for about 30 minutes. So thank you guys so much. And as always, if there's anything that I can do for you, feel free. And that goes for the listener as well. Call, text, email, find me on LinkedIn. I'll be happy to assist you guys to the best to my ability.
Yeah, it's very much appreciated. And I'll have links to Brian on LinkedIn as well as his podcast and Zscaler. Brian, you did a really great video on LinkedIn explaining what Zscaler does, and it really kind of applies to that ZTNA model. I definitely recommend people check that out. And, those links will be in the show notes so people can check it out. Jim, what about yourself? Any final words of wisdom?
I mean, meeting with Brian and hearing, what ZTNA is all about, It's been tremendously educational to me. I hope it was to our listeners as well. And I really encourage people that if this is the kind of content you want to keep hearing more about, or you have some other ideas for things you'd like us to talk about on the show, let us know. And I think LinkedIn is probably the best way to do that.
Yeah, it's very great way to get a hold of us. Real quick thing I just remembered. There was an individual who reached out to me on LinkedIn, and I'm going to look up his name real quick because I'm going to probably butcher it. But he tapped a article that I had written for Identropy way back in the day around Star Wars and identity and access management. His name is Ekram. I hope I pronounced it correctly. Ekram Malkuk. And he did a spin on that was for voice biometrics. So he tagged me on LinkedIn. It was very nice. I was like, oh, okay, cool. Right. This is something I wrote like 5 years ago or something like that, just kind of getting into the space. And he has a pretty interesting take on voice biometrics. And maybe that's something that we can maybe bring to the show at some point around androids and computers talking to each other. And, what does voice biometrics mean if it's if it's C3PO and R2D2 talking to each other? How do they authenticate through voice biometrics? How does that even work, right? So I thought it was a very interesting spin. So that, that's a great example of kind of the LinkedIn community. I think that, they've been reaching out to folks like us. But I think, this is a good spot that we'll go ahead and leave it. I think my last words of wisdom is it's okay to get smarter. Mistakes made, or in hindsight's 2020, and it's okay to move on from those and figure out what worked and what didn't and move forward from there. So with that, we'll go ahead and close it out for this week. I would highly suggest checking out Brian and his podcast. It's the PEBKAC, PEBKAC podcast. You can find it on Apple podcasts directly. Did I get that right, Brian, or is it the other way around?
Unfortunately, that one was already taken. So PEBCAK.
CAK. PEBCAK. My bad. I want to make sure we get the right plug in there. As a fellow, identity information security podcaster. So it's very much conversational, just like ours. So definitely recommend checking it out and showing some support over there. And like I said, I'll have a link to their Apple podcast page so you can check it out in the show notes. So with that, you can also check our website at identityatthecenter.com, and we're on Twitter at IDAC Podcast. And I think that's a pretty good spot to leave it. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Jim, for being part of the conversation today. And we'll talk with everyone in the next one. Thanks. Thanks for listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe and visit us on the web at identityatthecenter.com.